welcome to Catholica and our home up here in the mountains, and congratulations on this wonderful little book that you published.
Climbing Out of Yesterday. Just, can you give us a bit of a brief biographical overview of your story?
Yes. I was born in Young, which is a substantial town on the southwest slopes of New South Wales. My family had all been in the district, Gayalong, Bynalong, Burua, since the 1850s. My father's grandmother was a Quaker from Dorchester in England. Her brother and her first cousin were publishers. They both started substantial publishing companies. Castle, Petter and Galpin, and then Ward Lock. And so I've got this 6 Irish great-grandparents and 2 basically of English. One of the English lines, the first one of them was a forger who was sentenced to be hanged in England in 1802, and instead he got sent out here, thank goodness. So I got this very strong kind of Catholicism. My mother's family were poor, very poor. They're a family that keeps secrets, and I can't find out what was going on really. My father's family were they were secretive as well. And it's hard to find out what they were doing. But my father's main aim in life was to make sure that we went to Catholic schools, and he came from a family where they were always fighting. So he told me there were 2 things that were important. 1, never get mixed up in other people's domestics. And 2, no matter what you do, you'll always be welcome at home, because his siblings hadn't been. When I was in 5th and 6th class, I was taught by a Christian brother called Jack Cummins, who was enthusiastic, innovative, kindly, and I think basically when I looked around, he was the only man that I felt I wanted to be like. So I started saying I wanted to be a brother. By the time I was 15, I wasn't at all sure about that, but the Christian Brothers had a way of, once you said you wanted to be one, you weren't easily let go. So at 15 I went off to Strathfield, and our training in many ways was awful. I have an impression that some of the sex abuse crisis which the Christian Brothers were really mixed up in is due to our really poor formation. I think I've written it in the book, I've forgotten, but we were taught an enormous amount about obedience, nearly as much about poverty, and our whole training in celibacy was one morning's lecture by an ancient Jesuit about daffodils. And
Daffodils?
Daffodils. Well, actually, a friend of mine reckons it was daisies, but
it was a flower.
One of my friends who's still in the Brothers and is in their governance, anytime we meet, he says, I'm not sure if I've got a pistil or a stamen. It was disastrous.
Oh dear.
But given that our teacher training was exemplary,
yeah.
There were 3 Christian brothers particularly. There was a guy, Columba Davey, who was in charge of us, who taught us English. And for one thing, he told me I could write. And for another thing, he gave us a book list and said, read these. And they were Decline and Fall by Evelyn Waugh, The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy, John Millington Synge's Riders to the Sea and Playboy of the Western World, Voss, Patrick White, and a few others. And I didn't know that there were books like that in the world. I was just astonished. And that Evelyn Waugh was a Catholic and he could write something like Decline and Fall. I was just amazed. And Finian Markwell taught us how to teach. And Finian was very conservative, but he actually told us why he had voted against when there was a referendum about banning the Communist Party in 1949 or whatever year it was. Finian said, I voted not to ban them because if they can ban the communists, they can ban us. And I thought to myself, this man, well, I didn't think this really, but I realised Finian thinks through things that he does. And then Chris Harris, who was just a brilliant teacher who could teach nearly anything. And Finian Markle said to us, you're to prepare everything. You never go into school unprepared. But you prepare your religion lessons first. And if you can't get everything prepared, you've prepared your religion lesson. And St. Augustine wrote this letter in the 4th century called De Catechizandis Rudibus, which means on the basics of religious education, or catechesis, in which he said the very first thing is that you have to teach with hilaritas. And it doesn't mean hilarity, it means joy. And I used to think, I've got to teach religion as if it's joyful. This is what we're doing. This is what we're there for.
This comes through in this book, I think. The way you tell stories is there's this joy and lightness to it. You know, I forget how you end that chapter. Oh yeah, chapter 16. You end. Such is life. C'est la vie.
Yeah.
And
Ned Kelly as well.
Yes, that's true.
And the post you had on Catholica yesterday was similar. You had this light thing. It's about death, you know.
Yes.
I hope I forget what the words were. Millie.
Well, what sort of value do you get from writing? You know, is there an enjoyment that...
I enjoy it, and one of the things about writing is that usually I don't put anything up until I've spent several days on it. Sometimes I do, but so I rework things until I'm happy with them. And I forget who said it first, but someone said, I don't know what I think until I write it down.
Yeah.
And I'm often like that. I write it and I enjoy the stories. My mother, poor old Mum was very anxious and she used to talk flat out and used to drive me nuts. But she was also a good storyteller. And we stay...
Verbally or did she write?
Oh, no, verbally.
Yeah.
Mum stayed in Young all her life, and so when the family came back, and we had lots of cousins and stuff, Mum literally knew where the bodies were buried. She could say, oh, they're buried at Maringo, or they're buried at Cowra, or...
Yeah.
I remember the night she rang me up, I was still in the Brothers, telling me we had 3 convicts as ancestors.
Was she excited?
I think, yeah, she was.
Because that once upon a time was something that it was frowned upon. Nowadays it's like, oh, I've got it's like the Holy Grail, isn't it?
Well, exactly. She had a cousin who did a very long term in Goulburn Jail for manslaughter. It was a pub fight. And actually I've written it up there. And I think she would like me to have written it up. She knew the stories, she had an extraordinary memory. She could tell people who they were, where they came from. I was just writing up the other day, I went to school with a guy called Johnny Regan, who was a psychopath, and he ended up being shot by 3 people. His mother was convinced it was the police, and everyone else is convinced it was George Freeman and a few people like that. Johnny was a horrifying person. But Mum went to school with his mother. Claire Rowell, her name was. Her mother used to bake her own bread, and Mum's mother used to buy her own bread. So they used to swap sandwiches because Mum preferred home baked, and so they'd say, "What do you want on your sandwiches tomorrow?" to each other as they finished school. So, I mean, Claire was a tough lady. Her father was a violent drunk, and but when Johnny got shot, he was only 29, so it was about 1973 or something. Mum prayed for him every day for the rest of her life.
Did she?
She was convinced that, you know, somebody had to, and Johnny didn't have many friends.
So anyway, you were talking about, you know, you came through young, and you came through that system. You then entered the Brothers, and you were with the Christian Brothers.
I was
for a
in
number
the
of
Brothers
years.
for 17 years.
Yeah.
For which I'm grateful.
How do you sort of view religious life now, from the sort of perspective of being out of it for some time now?
Well, there are hardly any left as far as I can see, and they're nearly all old.
Yeah.
And I think some of the brothers anyway are traumatised from all the stuff that's happened, and actually from our training. I believe in religious life. I believe that some people are called to religious life. I think some people are called for a while. I would love there to be people who are living religious life in a community who are vital and interested and encouraging and...
And wouldn't it be wonderful to say, I decide I'm going to be, I'm going to profess my, make my profession here, but it's a 5-year term or it's a 10-year term.
Yes, I think that there are some, I mean, I find even things like the Trappists and the Carthusians and the Carmelite nuns and stuff, I think there are people called to that. I think they're a very tiny number.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted that some people can live their lives like
Are
that.
doing that, yeah.
And I've written somewhere, some of the best people I've met, without any doubt, are brothers or ex-brothers or priests or ex-priests or nuns or ex-nuns.
You're describing most of my friends.
Yeah, they're just the amazing things, and that's why I think the church has some hope and some future. The best things like Gregorian chant, St Vincent's Hospital, the social work we do, the schools we run, the education we have. But we make the mistake time and again of making things doctrine when they're not doctrine. Erin and I go to France occasionally, and we've spent some time in Toulouse, and in Toulouse there's this fabulous church, the name of which I can't remember for the moment, and under the main altar are the bones of Thomas Aquinas. And I remember the first time I saw that, I thought, goodness gracious, imagine he existed and he was a bloke and he had bones.
He had bones and all.
Aquinas spent his life theologising and philosophising, and he was the best brain in Europe at the time, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And he died thinking it was all a waste of time. And then they go and make him doctrine, as if you have to believe him, or as if you have to do philosophy that way. Or
But
as if,
that was much later, wasn't it?
oh, yeah.
After the event, yeah.
Oh, long after.
He was
He
a
was regarded as a
heretic.
heretic until the 19th century.
Yeah.
But Karl Rahner and these will eventually be made doctrine by somebody, even though at the moment they're sus.
Yeah.
Because for some reason human beings can't leave it alone. They can't say, well, you have to think about that. One of my big breakthroughs, I think, was a few years ago it occurred to me that nobody in the history of the universe knows what happens to you when you die, because no one's come back. Now, Jesus did, or might have, or whatever. But he didn't say anything. He didn't say anything about...
He didn't say
What
this is
was
what
on the
this
other
is what's-
side?
No!
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only word we've got is Kerry Packers, and he said nothing. No, I mean, I wouldn't believe Kerry, but... so we don't know.
Yeah.
And goodness knows what will happen. So you just have to...
One of the interesting things you just said is that you've been taught by your students, what I've found is that becoming the parent of adult children, I find myself being educated by my own children
yes.
these days.
Yes.
And it seems to me one of the problems the church has is that's the one thing that bishops miss out on, because they never have responsibility for bringing up their own offspring to adult maturity.
Yes.
And, I think, the one thing in favour of married priests would be the very fact that being educated by your students or by your own children is a critical part of the journey into adulthood.
Oh, yes.
You spent a long time with young people.
Yes.
But you say now have been a while since you've sort of been around young people, but you must have an opinion. How do you think they are with things like belief and religion and all of that now?
For whatever reason, I've never had any I can't think of the word. I've always disbelieved anyone, Plato, Socrates, anyone, who says the younger generation aren't as good as we are. My first class, third class, Bondi Beach, 1964, are now about 63, I think. So they're grandparents. The last people I taught, which was 8 or 9 years ago, are in their 20s or early 30s. They're all just as good as each other. There are the good ones and bad ones. There are the thinkers and the non-thinkers. There are. I think the young now have the enormous advantage of not being segregated, for one thing. I spend a bit of I go into the WEA in town, and I often have lunch underneath what's a town hall station. And on top of Town Hall Station, you've got the Town Hall, of course, but you've also got St Andrew's Cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral, and St Andrew's Cathedral School. And I often sit and watch the kids from that school, boys and girls, wandering around together. And I sometimes envy them. I'm just touched by the fact that the boys and the girls talk to each other civilly, and they're just people. And I'd love to have done that. I grew up in a country town. I still don't know the girls I was in school with, because after second class, when I was seven, we weren't allowed to talk to them.
Oh, you weren't allowed to talk to them?
No, if you were seen talking to them, you'd get roused on them.
See?
And then, of course, we were supposed to marry them.
And I wonder why there's a sexual abuse crisis.
Well, exactly.
When boys and girls can't even talk to one another.
Exactly.
It's madness. I can remember that the boys used to be shipped off to the brothers after for year 5 and 6. You know, that it was the girls only remained at the primary school when I was there.
I think that basically the official church is not saying anything very much that is relevant to young people.
Well, they've just had the synod on young people. We covered it on Catholica, and one of the things that struck me was that the young people who were, the auditors of this whole thing, because of course they would never have a vote.
No.
Well, they let the men heads of religious orders vote, but they didn't let the women heads of religious orders vote. So there's that misogyny still well and truly ensconced there. But I even was struck that the young people who were the sort of sample, if you will, that were auditing this whole thing were not representative of most young people.
Oh, no.
I know. They were very much that very small group of very faithful sort of conservative even version of Catholicism, which, a tiny, tiny percentage of young people might think that way, and the vast majority don't. But the bishops don't want to hear that.
I think, on the whole, people do things because they need to do them. I mean, my ancestors coming to this country needed to be good Catholics because we had all these advantages. I mean, they didn't look like advantages, but we had anti-Catholicism. We had them with all the money.
It was a them versus us,
Them
wasn't
with
it?
all the power. We had the good fortune that, I'm very doubtful about Catholic schooling in the 50s. I think in country towns, a lot of Catholic secondary schools did more damage than good. But we had all these things that forced us to keep together and kept us together. We needed the church. We needed to say, I'm a Catholic. And gradually, in fact, it wasn't all that gradual. It took from about 1968 to about 1973, they just disappeared. Just went. Somehow, the church has to find a way of being needed.
You see, I can remember, I think it was at one of those missions, you know, that the Redemptorists used to go around and do the hellfire and brimstone missions in parishes, and I can remember it was the first time that I ever remember, and it was just after Humanae Vitae had come out. And I can remember one of the ladies in our parish, and she was, you know, in the choir, and she was, you know, a good Catholic woman, but I remember her standing up, and I remember her shaking with anger at this priest who had been going on about how wonderful Humanae Vitae was. And I remember her saying, the bishops got that wrong, and if they got that wrong, what else did they get wrong?
Exactly.
Now, I've thought of that many, many years since then, because I think in that one statement that she crystallised why that decline happened so quickly. There were such high expectations leading up to that. You know, the commission that had been formed by by Paul VI, and they'd made, of course, the mistake of publishing some of their stuff.
Or it wasn't a mistake,
already.
the tablet and the NCR
Well,
did it.
yes. And, you know, Ottaviani sort of got in behind the scenes and did his thing, but for so many people, they had higher expectations, and I remember this woman had probably 8 or 9 children. And she was not uncommon in those days either.
No,
you know, that was before the Catholic contraception of a hysterectomy happened, you know. But her being so angry and saying they got it wrong, what else did they get wrong?
Well, I think I have no figures for this, but just around, in my own experience, the number of women who've given it up, my guess is much bigger than the number of men who've given it up. I think they lost the women. I mean, I know Catholic sisters who are still sisters, but who are quite alienated from the official church. It's, I think the women have walked away.
Yeah. Can I just move the topic to another thing? You've had long experience in Catholic tertiary education.
Yes.
And I wonder if you have opinions on what's happened to Catholic tertiary education, particularly in the Australian context. You know, one of the accusations that's made is that back about 10, 20 years ago, George Pell made a big thing, we're going to take over Catholic
Clean up the Catholic Church in Australia.
Yeah, through Catholic tertiary education. He did a big takeover of Catholic universities and Catholic higher education. I interviewed Dr. Peter Tannick at the time, the Vice Chancellor of Notre Dame, and we spoke about this when, you know, he imported the University of Notre Dame into Sydney. You know, Tannick's idea was he just wanted a little office in Sydney for the students coming from America to stop off and see the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Well, George Pell, no, we're going to have a full university here. What impressions have you got from your years in Catholic tertiary education? Is it doing well? Is it?
I'm not sure how it's going. I don't know how Notre Dame's going. I think tertiary education, full stop, in Australia is in trouble. There's so much administration, so many administrators that the ordinary teachers and lecturers are being hamstrung. Someone I know who was Deputy Vice-Chancellor of a university, also retired, but I said to him a few years ago, everyone I talk to from my old place of work seems to be unhappy. And he said, tell me a campus of any university where they're happy. So I think that's a general problem. I think George Pell did enormous damage to the whole Australian church. Apart from just the politics, you know, them, whoever they are, shifting him from Melbourne to Sydney to so-called clean up Sydney.
It was to clean up the Australian church, not just Sydney.
Yeah, and also this kind of weird. They wanted him to be a cardinal so that he could vote for the Pope and all that sort of stuff. They wanted his vote. I've had this feeling for years and years. I used to work with Barry Collins, who later was a bishop and died young out at Forbes. But I used to have the impression that John Paul II had not the faintest idea of what the Western world's about.
Yeah.
He had no idea of what it means to live in the West. Now, we mightn't be the majority, but we are important too. And actually, poor old John Maloney, who's just died, he taught me at ANU many years ago. He was quoted in his obituary, he was a professor at ANU, saying, he wants us to be Polish Catholics and I don't want to be a Polish Catholic. For various reasons, I don't want to be a Polish Catholic either. I like Polish food, and I think some Australian Catholic tertiary stuff at the moment is being run at the top by people who are very conservative.
Yeah.
And I mean, my message
But
is...
but that's part of the legacy of Pell and the cleaning up the church in Australia.
Yeah.
And the legacy of John Paul II being there for so
Yeah.
long,
Yeah.
and Benedict, they're the ones who appointed all the bishops.
I think, you know, in the last two pontificates, we had these gentlemen come in who were both very affected with living under totalitarian regimes of the opposites, you know, Nazism and communism. And, you know, one wanted to impose on the world, on the Western world, Polish piety, and the other one was Bavarian piety.
Yes, and
and
neither of
it
them...
doesn't work.
No, and John Paul wouldn't believe. I mean, Machiel and these people who were fiercely sexually abusive of men, women and children, he simply wouldn't believe it because apparently in Poland the KGB or somebody, you know, set up priests they didn't want and said they were sex abusers. Now, I can understand why he might be like that, but you can't run the whole church as if it's Poland.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Or Germany or Bavaria.
Exactly. So now listen, Climbing Out of Yesterday is a beautiful book.
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed working on this book with you. What sort of reactions have you been getting from people who have read it?
My family think it's very funny. I've written a bit about some of my experiences in Young. My son keeps reminding me of things that I've said in there and quizzing me about them. I think I haven't had many reactions. I know Ed Campion's got a review in the Swag whenever it comes out. And a woman has written one for the WATAC newsletter, and she was very pleased with it. She actually compared one of them with Henry Lawson, which I was a bit thought flattering. I think I've had only good reactions. I was terrified. I'm anxious I'm not sure if it's by birth or by training, but I found some bits of it very hard to leave in, particularly the stuff about sex abuse. And it cost me quite a lot of anxiety, those bits. But someone who went through training with me and someone who's a bit younger than me who was in the Brothers, they've both thanked me for it.
I get a lot of positive feedback because a lot of these stories, of course, were previously published in Catholica. And but everybody, I've never found anybody who doesn't like Graham English as a writer.
Oh, right.
You know, you're one of the perennial favourites on Catholica.
Right.
So,
I think I've written it several times, but my old novice master, Victor Bell, who died last year aged 100, just short of 101, by accident, years ago, I didn't write it by accident, I wrote an account of our training and I was critical. And because a man, the archivist in Strathfield, was very careless, the stuff got published. And it was ironic because sometimes you're so keen to get published and you can't, and all of a sudden I was keen not to, and I did. And I ran into another brother, a man who's still a brother, and said to him, I'm so embarrassed because I named names and I know I offended some people. And he said, let's go and ask you. This was at a funeral. So he calls Vic over and he said, what did you think of what Graham said? And he said, at last somebody said it.
There
and
you
I
go.
think...
I mean, I was glad that you left those things in.
Yes.
Because otherwise it becomes the huge elephant in the room, isn't it? I mean, there you were in the Christian Brothers and, you know, all of Australia knows now, in fact the world knows, that there was a problem with Christian Brothers.
Yeah.
Not exclusively a Christian brother problem either,
No.
I might add, it was everywhere, but...
Yeah. I know men now who are brothers who pick up the phone and won't say Christian Brothers.
Really?
They're just embarrassed and hurt. And
Isn't that sad?
Oh, it's very
so
sad.
difficult for the ones, the non-perpetrators, who have to live with what these people have done.
And even, I think there are two kinds of perpetrators. I think there are the out-and-out pedophiles. I think there are some, I'm not sure of this, and I'm not an expert, but I think there are some men who, through our really seriously inadequate training, were lonely or sad or something. And
what Richard Sype called Forever 14.
Forever 14. I mean, as you're growing up, there are some things that are appropriate when you're 14, but they're not appropriate when the child is 14 and you're 36.
That's right.
But if your psyche is still 14, so I feel enormous sadness for some of these people. Some of them I don't. Some of them there's at least, there are several who'll die in jail.
Yeah.
And they should.
Yeah.
But there are some who need to forgive themselves and be forgiven. And actually, I'm not sure about this, but I have the impression that the brothers are pretty good at being forgiving. They're kind of, I mean, they're living through terrible times. It's a hard time to be around.
Yeah, what's the future for the brothers? You know, I was working with them closely in Perth a few years ago before I came over here, and you know, they were redirecting their work to the Philippines and to Africa.
Yeah.
Is that going to work? And you know, the head of the brothers was Brother Philip Pinto from India.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if it'll work.
They're not going to get any more recruits from
They're not
Australia.
going to get them here.
Yeah.
I think they are getting them there.
Yeah.
If they form them properly, if they take account of the cultures they're working in.
Yeah.
I mean, the church in Africa has all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
But I'm firmly of the belief that the church will always have problems while ever men and women are not equal in the church. If you have men and women working side by side.
And I think the whole thing of... we've spent quite a lot of time knocking around with uniting church ministers for various reasons, men and women. I think the theology of priests being ontologically different causes enormous problems. I find the uniting church people we were at a celebration recently where there were 3 or 4 Uniting Church ministers running it, and they just seemed to me to be more humane or something. Now, there are lots and lots of humane Catholic priests, of course.
Yeah, of course,
but somehow that has to change.
It's almost seems to me, though, that the wonderful religious brothers, sisters, priests, the good ones are good despite their formation, not because of it.
Oh, sure. And I mean, there are people to whom that kind of life suits them.
Yeah.
There are people, I mean, I ran into people when I was leaving who said, I'm too old to leave now, but I would if I could. And they've continued to be good men in that case. I think it's somehow or other it all has to be rethought. But it has to be rethought in each culture. This trying to run everything, trying to run the Australian Church from a desk in the Vatican.
It's a nonsense,
It's
isn't it?
bizarre.
Look, I think one of the beauties of climbing out of yesterday, and in fact one of the reasons why I'm glad this book came about, you know, Jesus' way was as a storyteller. He was able to, you know, all the parables tell us that these wonderful truths can be understood better in when they're situated within a context, a story. And, you know, one of the things that I love about Climbing Out of Yesterday is that it's a book of stories. And each story is, you know, you have a very self-effacing sort of way of communicating, which is unique amongst some writers I can think of, but also that, you know, you sort of, they're not just a story about this happened in the past, it's more reflective than that, isn't it? You're looking at these terms, these stories in terms of what's going on today, haven't you?
Yeah, I reckon the first law of teaching is at least don't bore yourself. And if you're not boring yourself, there's a chance that you're not boring them.
Someone else.
And I mean, there are some things I know I'm good at and other things I know I'm not good at. But I've found that whatever it is I'm trying to explain to other people, if I can explain it to myself first, there's a chance I can do it with them. So I think that's my way of teaching. It's how does this make sense to me?
I think it'll become a great resource for, you know, this plenary council's coming up. And they're sort of, you know, they're trying to get us to think about this and think about that and think about the other thing. And I'm sitting here thinking, everybody needs to write Climbing Out of Yesterday.
Yes.
Because I think that there are insights in there that inform the situation today. It's about saying, you know, this is the experience, and I think this might be why that happened, and this is the result of it. You know, maybe we need to examine that more closely. I hope it's a book that anybody who wants to participate in that council reads first.